Starting the second module and jumping into the second industrial revolution. So we'll talk about the management principles that defined the second industrial revolution, are the ones that emerged during this time. That's kind of what we'll get into tonight. Stats from the first exam. Average was 97. It was about 10 points higher than last semester. Average time to complete, 44 minutes. That was about 5 minutes faster. It tells me that it's time for a new exam. So I always like, when I introduce a new exam, I just like to pull the curtain back. Like the average is usually low to mid 80s at the very first time I give one, because I try to purposely throw some in that require some thinking. And then like, I always look at the stats and say, oh, is there a majority of questions everybody get wrong, or is there a wrong answer a lot of people pick that was confusing? And then I tweak answers to where they're less confusing, and ultimately the average is around 90. But then like when it jumps this comes like, oh, there's copies of the exam, which is fine, whatever. But this means I get to do a double check. So the good news is there didn't seem to be any questions that were confusing that I have to fix. But it gives me a good check to see how we're doing. Case study phase 2, I believe, is due tonight. Is that right? Hopefully most people have done their peer reviews, and if not, some of you will, in one group, will have only gotten 2 instead of 3. Just a heads up, potentially only 2 instead of 3. We'll work around that going forward. So after tonight, phase 3 will become a thing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about phase 3. The way I have you set up, and I'll go into Canvas here. And the way I have you set up is in groups of 4, so that the 3 people you reviewed would also be the 3 people who reviewed you. And so I did that specifically so that when we get to phase 3, it'll make it simpler for you. So that when you're setting up these one-on-one, two-way feedback sessions, you only have 3 people to do it with. Because there is a way to where like the 3 people you reviewed would not necessarily be the 3 people who reviewed you, but then you would be setting up multiple meetings, and I didn't want to complicate things even further. So in phase 1, you turn the assignment in the phase 1 assignment. And then in phase 2, you actually left the feedback in phase 1, right? And so like if I just picked someone and an assignment, like I can actually see all the different people who left feedback. You probably only saw what you left for the person, but the person who received it actually sees what everyone left, and you should see that on yours as well. So phase 3, what I'm looking for is for you to take a week. So I think phase 3 is due in 3 weeks from phase 2. So I want you to take a week, no more than a week. I want you to take your first week to take written feedback that you received and revise your first submission as you see fit. So a couple of clarifications I want to make there. Can you hear me on Zoom? Just checking. Yes, okay, thank you. I was getting a warning to turn up the volume, but maybe I'm just not screaming loud. Not from anyone on Zoom. I was getting like a Zoom warning to say turn it up. So just to be safe. We're good. So you have 3 weeks, take a week to revise. You do not feel obligated. Just because someone gave you a piece of feedback, don't feel obligated to implement it just because you feel like you have to. I'm not going to go back and look at all the feedback you got and go, oh, they told you to do this and you didn't. That's not how I'm going to grade phase 2. I'm going to grade phase 2 solely on the quality of feedback you gave to your peers. Your grade will be how good of a feedback using radical candor did you give your peers. And there was a rubric on that, I think. So, and then phase 3 will kind of just be a self-report grade based on your one-on-one sessions. So if you don't think the suggestion makes your work better, you don't have to implement it. That's fine. Your goal toward the end is to turn in what you feel is the best deliverable for the assignment, the original assignment. The peer reviews are to practice radical candor in various ways. We did the written version, which is kind of just one way, but then having it the in-person or virtual, that's the way I want. So phase 3, I want to be either in person, or I know that's not possible in a lot of situations. If not, I want it to be like virtual, be it Zoom, Teams, whatever, Google Meet, with video. I prefer you not do just phone because that takes away the dimension that I'm trying to add to the assignment of having the one-on-one discussion. Because again, what do? We're trying to practice giving and receiving feedback based on radical candor. It happens in different dimensions in the actual work world, right? There's written, but then there's also that organic, two-way, face-to-face feedback where you can exchange conversation, and that adds a different dimension, and the phone just really doesn't do it. So that's what I'm looking for. Take a week to revise yours based on written feedback as you see fit, and let your peers do the same. After that, begin connecting. So what I have done is in the people section, and I'm going to be very curious how this works. So this was the first year I had people who couldn't, in my other grad class, I had people who couldn't see people in other sections. But hopefully once you were peer reviewed, you could. I don't know in this class. But I made groups of each of the sub group of 4 people. So find the group that you're in. And then each group, if you click on these dots, has a home page where you can actually go and communicate with each other. You can do announcements, you can create a discussion thread, you can swap contact information and connect with each other that way. So that's a way to do it. I recommend that way. Another way to do it is, let's figure out how to get the heck out of this. Like you could actually leave your contact information in the same place that you gave feedback in phase 2. Like you could actually go into whoever you were giving feedback to and leave it as a piece of feedback. Like, hey, my contact info is this, and put it in there. Just try to connect with each other. I prefer you use the group page because that just makes the most sense. We get in touch with each other after a week. So take a week, revise your original submission as you see fit. And then what am I looking for you to do? You'll have, I guess it's not live yet, but I'll give you a preview. You'll just have these assessment forms that I want you to fill out. After each one-on-one exchange, that just basically says, how well did they do on the care personally axis and the challenge directly axis, and some general comments. So solely left y'all to rate each other. Rate, honestly, just because you give each other all fives doesn't mean I'm gonna give better grades or worse grades. Like, fill it out honestly. That's not really what I'm basing the grades on. Like, if you put up here that you only met for 5 minutes and you give each other 5, I'm probably gonna pay attention to that. Oh, you only met for 5 minutes. So just try to assess that, and then you also do a self-assessment. So you'll have 4 things for this phase that you'll turn in: 3 peer assessment forms for each one of your peers that you meet with, and then a self-assessment form. So 4 things that you'll turn in, 3 separate sessions that you'll have. So I want you to meet one-on-one with each other. What I would say is the conversations I would like you to have are, hey, based on your feedback to me in the written section, these are some things that I changed. Thank you. Here's why I found it helpful. This is what I did. Clarification. Hey, you made this comment. I was curious what you meant. Here's what I did, and have that, because I think that's important. A lot of times in one-way written communication, we don't get the opportunity for clarification. So that's another reason I added this phase, is to get to do that. So it's not like I want you to meet and just go over and repeat what you wrote. I want you to make changes based on the written feedback, and then discuss what changes you made, if there's changes you didn't make, reasons that you didn't, and just get to know each other and practice giving radical candidate feedback. That's what I'm looking for in phase 3. So that'll go live tonight or in the morning at midnight. And then you'll have, like I said, it'll be due in 3 weeks, right before spring break. So you'll have phase 3 out of your lap before spring break. Take a week, revise your original submission based on feedback you received in phase 2. Then phase 3, schedule your one-on-one sessions to discuss what changes you made, any potential other changes that you could see each other doing. Like, those are the conversations I'm looking for you to have. If you want to send each other your revised version before you have the one-on-one feedback, so that you can get reacquainted, and then feel free to do that as well. I'll leave that all up to you to reach out and connect with each other. Thoughts on that? Or questions? Okay. So we'll plow on in now to the second industrial revolution. We'll put module 1 behind us, where we kind of introduced engineering management, we introduced the management waste, and then we got into the first industrial revolution, which was kind of the time frame of mid-1700s to mid-1800s. And then around the 1860s or so, 1870s, depending on who you ask, we start to make the transition into the second industrial revolution. And then I'll define the second industrial revolution as going up until World War II-ish. So we'll kind of cover things through the end of the Second World War, 1940s or so, and end that as the second industrial revolution for our purposes. So what we're going to see are new versions of what we saw in the first industrial revolution. We're going to see advancements in power. We're going to go from steam being a novel invention for power to this thing called electricity. We're going to see advancements in transportation and mobilization. So we saw the steam engine and how that allowed for rail travel and steamboat travel across currents, and that being a major advancement in transportation in the first industrial revolution. We'll see the combustion engine, air flight, all of those things. in the second industrial revolution, all engineering feeds, right? Whether we call them the people were engineers or not, those are engineering feeds. So makes sense. And then we're going to have new things that we have to manage on the management side as well. So regardless of what it is, the things that we defined engineering and management by in the first industrial revolution. Engineering, using math and science to invent, design, and build stuff. We're going to continue doing that. We'll continue to be the role of the engineer in the second industrial revolution, and it'll continue to be the role of an engineer, period. But we're going to take on new roles. So I'm not going to necessarily cover in detail the way we covered all the introductions of the advancements of the loom and coal and all of that, and steam engine as technologies in the first industrial revolution, just because I don't cover electricity and all of that in detail in the second industrial revolution doesn't mean it's important. I'm covering how the role of the engineer has advanced during this time as well. So the role of the engineer advances more in terms of we're accepting a new role. We're going to continue to invent, design, and build stuff, but also take on a role of we also improve stuff. And manage stuff as well, but improve stuff. It's where my home discipline of industrial engineering came into being. And then from the management side, we're actually going to start to see some formalization of that thing called management. But we're still doing the same thing, pursuing a desired condition, getting from current condition to desired condition by managing our processes, leading people, all guided by some set of principles. So we talked about why is it important to study it from a historical standpoint, because we're going to keep seeing the same cycle over and over. In the first industrial revolution, we saw an introduction of technologies. We have a lot of automation in the textile industry. We also saw steam engine and steel production and all of that, which kind of led to each other, demands on each other. And then that led to reaction, the factory system. When we started inventing, mechanizing the loom, then that became the machinery became the way things were made. Instead of people going and getting raw material and bringing it home, all of a sudden people didn't have these new machines at home, so they went to these centralized places called factories to work. That created new social dynamics. The factory system, we saw the Luddites, we saw introduction of technology lead to people revolting, and based on factory system and the work environments, Luddites and revolts, we started to see new laws and policies and things come into place. We saw the Frame Breaking Act to calm the Luddites down and say, hey, stop breaking the new technologies or it's punishable by death. Or we saw the Factory Acts that said, hey, we probably shouldn't be working people 16 hours a day when we're 5 years old. And we had to start putting boundaries around that. And that framed the way, the new wave of management principles that we have to manage by, and ultimately what we engineer within to lead to the next set of processes and technologies. And so that full circle becomes an industrial revolution. So what do we need? I shared a video either in the Module 2 overview or in 2.1 section page on what is needed for an industrial revolution. And it's this intersection of things. One is the existence of natural resources. So what we saw in the first industrial revolution, that was coal, right? The fact that the first industrial revolution happened in Great Britain and not other places, one of the major contributors to this was the availability of cheap, clean coal in Great Britain. And the ability to, the steam engine came about originally to access more coal. And then the steam engine gave us all these other benefits of transportation and steel making. So we were able to use coal to power steam, to get more coal, to power more engines, and it became this beautiful cycle. So natural resources that lead to new ways of doing things, advances in technology. So we saw that the mechanization of one thing, the major industry at the time, textiles, We saw advancements in making steel, which was needed to advance the rail system. We're going to see the same thing in the second industrial revolution, just new, different types of technology. Communication will take a giant leap forward in this industrial revolution. The workforce, we needed people for an industrial revolution to happen. In the first industrial revolution, we had the agricultural revolution that had just happened and the Enclosures Act, which meant all the vast majority, 80% of the population in Great Britain had been an agrarian, agriculture-based population prior to the first industrial revolution. Then the Enclosures Act stopped allowing the common folk to use common land to farm because the Enclosures Act basically said, oh, now to farm land, you have to put up a fence or hedges and enclose the area that you farm. Well, a lot of the common folk didn't own the land they farmed, so they couldn't do that. So it took the ability for the regular folks to farm. Then we had the agricultural revolution, which greatly increased the productivity of farming. And so we had that movement of people into the cities. We called it urbanization. So the availability of a new group of people and the mechanization of the textile industry made the factory system possible. So we see a new influx of people into an area that leads to the second industrial revolution, and a lot of that. So the first industrial revolution kind of centered around Great Britain. Second industrial revolution centers kind of around the United States, and about 25 million new immigrants from the beginning of the second industrial revolution till the middle of it, mostly from Poland and Ireland and Europe and some places of Asia as well. But massive immigration during that time gave a new available workforce for new advancements. So all of these things are necessary, and just like we saw in the first industrial revolution, with great advancements in infrastructure, the abilities to make steel, to make buildings, to build railroads, we are going to see more advancements as well. Expansion of railroads, but also development of skyscrapers in terms of housing organizations and residential folks. And then, like I said, the ability to move within that infrastructure, the automobile, ultimately air flight. And we'll even be tinkering with the idea of space flight by the end of this second industrial revolution. So we come a long way in the next 100 years that we're talking about. So the role of the engineer, like I said, will continue to be inventing, designing, and building stuff, but we're going to take on a new role of how do we improve stuff. So the major focus that I'm going to have next week when we start talking about the processes and technologies of the second industrial revolution is going to be on productivity. So the role of the engineer in the first industrial revolution centered around being inventors of technology. And the added role of the engineer in the second industrial revolution is, given these technologies, how do we become more productive with them? So I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. And then from the management side, two prominent schools of management emerged during this time. So we went from no management. People worked in the cottage industry. They went and got stuff. They went home. They made stuff. Then we started showing up to factories. Supervision kind of happened organically based on who was the best at a job or loudest or the one who might be literate compared to everyone else, whatever the case may be. There was a very informal way of management that was evolving. And so we're finally going to start to see some formalized bounds around management. So two schools emerged prominently in management during the second industrial revolution: administrative management and scientific management. So I want to spend today talking about those two different schools of thought, starting with one of several people that will be introduced to over this industrial revolution with some derivative of the name Henry. So we're going to need a lot of different Henrys starting with this one, Andre. Andre Faye was French and was one of the pioneers of defining modern management. Matter of fact, he's known as the father of modern management. Not sure if he knows it or not yet. Not sure if anybody's clued him in. Hey, congratulations. You might be the father. You might want to get that test done, Andre. But father of modern management, he was a French mining engineer, but had an acumen for business, and he would observe how the organization, he worked for one of the largest iron and steel companies in France as an engineer, but ultimately worked his way up into management. And he published his experiences and what he ultimately documented as his own observations of principles in a publication translated into English as General and Industrial Management. It's a collection of observations that he put out in the 1900s. And it was in that book where he identified 6 industrial activities. So now that we have companies and organizations that function, he says we can classify these activities into 6 different types of things. The technical side, which is actually what we offer as an organization, what people are willing to pay for. That's the invention and the making of what it is we do. But then that's not enough just to invent and make stuff that people care about. We also have to let people know about us. Marketing. And contractually make some agreement that they'll exchange something for what we give them. So sales, contract, there's that function of business. Then there's the financial side, which is how do we manage cash flow? How do we invest? How do we use that to grow our company? Security. How do we protect our people and our assets? And information. Accounting. How do we keep track of what's coming in and out and making sure things line up? And then there's the 6th thing, this weird thing called management. And since that was a little ill-defined, he said, I'll break it down a little further for you. And the original functions of management were born based on Henri Faye, and his branch of administrative management became known as Fayism. Really clever name. But he said, if you want to know what it means to be a manager, here are the 5 things based on his observations, based on his experience. Here are the 5 things that managers need to be able to do. Plan. Have an idea what's going to be done over time, whether it be a day, a week. Organize. How are we organized as a company? Who does what role? Coordination, which is how do I get people in to work, which later became known as staffing. Command, which later became known as directing or leading, and controlling, which is how do I transactionally manage things from a financial standpoint and also sustain things once I get procedures in place to make sure that they're followed. So planning, organizing. Faye's original version was planning, organizing, coordinating, commanding, and control. He said, if you want to know what it means to be a manager based on my observations, these are the 5 things you need to be able to do. And I gave you, so I won't spoil it too much. I'll let us talk it out in the discussion thread. One of the new participation badges for this week is, these were the original words: planning, organizing, coordinating, commanding, control. Words are fascinating things. They take on different meanings over time. And sometimes we like to go back and hold them to the meanings they have today and go back and hold people to those, even though they didn't know what they would become known to be when they started using. But over time, people began changing different words to be a little more specific or a little more in line with the modern terminology. In other words, instead of coordination, what Fail was talking about with coordination was you need to have people in the organization doing different functions. We call that staff. What he meant as commanding later was redefined by people as directing. Well, it's not command. That sounds very military-like, but directing is telling people what to do. And then they softened it even more later on and said, maybe directing sounds a little one way. Let's call it leading. And we'll look at that in the third industrial revolution when people start going, oh, there's management, but then there's leadership. Those are different. You know, people started getting cute with that, and we'll talk about that in the next industrial revolution. But then, so the name started to change for the different functions. So I gave this kind of reflective activity to say, go research Fail's 5 functions of management, look at his definitions of them. Do these align with things that people in management positions do or should be doing now? Is it still relevant? And also, like, are there different words that may be more appropriate now than the ones that were used? And what might they be? I think it'll be a fun conversation that'll make us reflect on what the roles of management really should be. And what do we call it? But Fail was one of his major contributions was to be the first one to kind of put some kind of structure around. One, that acknowledge management is part of what happens in an organization, not just the doing part and the transactional part, but the actual management. But then also defining what it means to be a manager, acknowledging that it exists, trying to define what it means. And he went a little further and said, I'll even give you 14 principles. And again, he was saying these are not absolute, but they're a starting point of things based on his observations and his experiences that led to more success if they were in place, and things that needed to be considered by managers. So some of them will start to show up. Some of these have shown up already in things we discussed, and some will start to show up in other management philosophies that we see going forward. So I won't read all of them to you, but I shared an article for you to read that goes into more depth on Failism and his functions of management and the 14 principles. But one of them he talked about was division of work. So I know this was in the lecture that I missed a couple of weeks ago, but we talked about Adam Scott, the Scottish economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and he presented the idea of the free market and laissez-faire economics and leaving government leaves things alone. And part of that too is division of labor or specializing in a trade. In other words, instead of everybody trying to do everything, division of labor is specialized. I'm going to become a lawyer. I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to become this. And then he had something called enlightened self-interest that said, here's what makes certain jobs pay more based on difficulty, based on desirability to do it or whatever. He had a list of things that says, here's what makes jobs pay more. If people have enlightened self-interest, the supply for jobs and the demand for jobs will cause people to pursue jobs that pay more and ultimately balance out that, and we'll have the invisible hand that feeds everybody. That was Adam Scott's Wealth of Nations philosophy on economics, but one of the 3 fundamental things in Adam Scott's Wealth of Nations, there's division of labor based on enlightened self-interest, there's laissez-faire, which is government leave people alone and let business handle itself, don't intervene, and then some common currency to trade. When what I need is not, and what you need from me are not exactly the same. So currency allows us to have an equivalent values. So Henri Fail brings that up again and says division of work is a principle of management. We need to have specific tasks and specific people specializing in different things. There needs to be some level of authority that's clearly defined and not subjective. In other words, a reporting line. There needs to be some sort of discipline, and he's not talking about discipline as in go to your room, but some form of cultural discipline, unity of command, which means everyone only has one boss, not multiple bosses. So like that clears things up. Unity of direction means I don't have multiple branches where I report to somebody over the person that reports to me or something crazy there. There's one direction of communication. Remuneration, we have to have a way to pay people was one of them. He talks about centralization versus decentralization of resources. If, in other words, do we have all the accountants sit together, or does each part of the business have their own accountants spread apart? Orderliness, being organized. And so he talks about these are things that are important to have in place. So Henri Fail, major contribution, identifying the activities of an organization, one of which was management, identifying not only acknowledging management exists, but identifying 5 functions that we should be doing as managers, and then also 14 principles of management that help us be better at doing those 5 functions. Henri Fail, those are some of his major contributions, so wanted to introduce him. Another person who made a major contribution in terms of views on management during this time was a German guy named Max Weber. Germans like to pronounce their W's with V's. Max Weber, lawyer and economist. Another father here, he was one of the fathers of sociology. And he did a lot of things for our sake. What we care about are his contributions of defining bureaucracy and authority, and his writings on that. So when we hear the term bureaucracy, right, like it's sometimes kind of a negative thing because we think of, oh, it's something that ties us down. It's red tape. It's things that slow processes down, and it very much is now. But at the time when he was introducing the ideas of bureaucracy, that wasn't, it didn't have that connotation. He was simply talking about these are things that need to be in place to properly structure an organization to function. So whereas Fail was talking about here are things an individual manager should do from an organizational structure side, Weber was one of the first to introduce this is how we should structure our companies. And again, one of his 6 principles of an ideal bureaucracy, and by ideal, he just meant if these things are in place, we're probably doing pretty good. Specialization of labor, again, just like with Fail, just like with Adam Smith, was one of the things. We need to have division of work. We need to have very specific roles that we want different individuals to do and be very clear on what those are. We need rules and policies and procedures of how to do things. So formalize rules, document how do we hire people, what's expected of people, how do we promote people, how do we get paid, what are the, when I assign you specialization of labor, step 1, how do you know what to do? Here are procedures, here are steps. We've documented them. We need that, he said. We need a hierarchical structure. In other words, we need that organizational structure. Who reports to who and how does that work? Then we need people in place and we need actual ways to train them, heaven forbid. We need, and that needs to be a role of the supervisor, early management role, being able to be good at what you do, but also train other people on it. We need people in management positions that will put the company first and hold the line and not go against the policies. And they need to be fair. So he's like, these are 6 things that kind of define structure. So he was one of the first ones on a large scale to present that. I know a lot of this stuff we take for granted now, but part of what I'm trying to do is show the evolution of engineering, the evolution of management, the roles of people in those positions over time and how we got to where we are now, so that we can better predict what those roles might look like in the future. And so Max Weber was the first one in the early 1900s to start to give some roles to structure, bureaucracy. And then he does an interesting little exercise. And again, I've shared an article with you that's part of the reading for this section. So I won't go into all the details, but he goes into this interesting view on 3 ways that people traditionally had gained positions of authority. And based on it, if they gained their position of authority in each of those 3, how they might carry it out about these 6 rules of bureaucracy differently. So it's a fun read. In other words, someone may have assumed authority through traditional terms. And by traditional, what he meant was through some kind of accepted custom or lineage. So think of the British royal family. Very historical, oldest male child, unless there isn't one. I don't even know the algorithm of what it is, but there's a set lineage. That's how people assume authority. Or in some places, it may be more charismatic. Someone with a lot of charisma may end up in power. See a lot of revolutionaries like this that lead movements because they can get people behind their ideals to overthrow, and I've seized power because I have this charisma, and now I'm in position based on my traits, my personality, that someone recognized and agreed to follow me, maybe overthrow the traditional sense, if the traditional version even existed to begin with. Or there may be the rational legal way of assuming authority, which is we have an actual set of rules that we elect people by and follow them and put people in place based on them. So he started to identify those different things. So from an administrative management side, 2 major players, Henri Fayol, Max Weber. Henri Fayol, Functions of Management, 14 Principles of Management, and then Max Weber, Structure and Bureaucracy and Authority. Help define the principles of management during the time. Here's something new that was happening with the engineering the engineering profession. It was becoming formalized. If we remember, we talked about last Industrial Revolution when the Erie Canal was built in like 1811. There were only 30-something engineers in the U.S. period, so there was this crisis of, hey, we need this skill set in this new country. So they formed the U.S. Military Academy School for Engineering. It was the first school for engineering. And then they realized after the War of 1812 that hadn't fully prepared people at that time. So they went and got people from France, from England, brought them over, to deepen the depth. That's what we do in America really well, is take people from other places and bring them over here. This principle was kind of built off of that operation or project paperclip or whatever it was. So building that depth and helping form the early engineering institutions faster. And so that was what was happening in the early 1800s. Then as engineering became more of an established profession, they began forming professional societies to communicate best practices, having conferences. So the very first type of engineering was civil engineering. So it's not a surprise that the very first professional society in engineering was the American Society for Civil Engineers. Mining engineers formed one shortly after that, and ISEEM, American Society for Mechanical Engineers, was formed in 1880. And interestingly enough, the early mechanical engineering days sound like a lot of modern industrial engineering days. Mechanical engineers were formed to address the issues of factory operation, because that's where machines and stuff that moved were mainly being used at the time. So as they began to have these meetings, one of the monumental contributions, we have our second Henry of the day, Henry Town, where they, at the 1886 ISEEM annual meeting, presented his paper that I've shared. It's also part of the readings for today. His paper, and it's not a long read, The Engineer as an Economist. And so it was in that paper where he made a call for the role of the engineer to grow, to share management experience as well. So Henry Town, mechanical engineer by trade, was actually the ISEEM president. And he said, there are two things going on in organizations. There's the technical side of things, but then there's also the transactional side of things, which is, how do we document things? How do we pay people? How do we get paid by suppliers? How do we coordinate all of that? Describing management functions. And he said there's a drastic need in his paper that both of these areas have people in the organization that have knowledge in those areas. And he said, ideally, knowledge in both of those areas, the goods to be produced and the how to observe, record, and analyze data, reside in one person. Very rare, especially in those days, he said, but the person that should probably be engineers are best qualified. Because processes in engineering are documented, management not so much at the time. And the matter of management is of equal importance to engineering. So in some of the early language, whether he realized it or not, was calling for a field in engineering management. We need to have a skill set of people who not only know the technical side of the goods and the services that are being offered as our company and had a part in the designing and invention of that, but also how the business runs. And we need people with knowledge of both things. Engineer as an economist. So his paper was known for a couple of things. One was the impact that it had. He was one of the first to kind of call out that someone with knowledge in both of those would be vital. And here we are with the profession in engineering management all these years later. But also his presentation at that conference was heard by and had a major impact on a gentleman named Frederick Taylor, who happened to be in attendance. And Frederick Taylor would go on to pioneer something that we would call scientific management. So we looked at administrative management, an approach to management with Fayol and with Weber. And Henry Town's kind of calling on this crossover. And then Frederick Taylor was inspired by that at the 1886 American Society of Manufacturing Engineers Conference. So who is this fellow? Frederick W. Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor. So he's another father, he's double father, scientific management and industrial engineering. So I got acquainted with this fellow back in my undergrad when I was told he was the father of industrial engineering, which is my undergrad discipline, and pioneered something called scientific management. But if you dig back and look at this, he's a fascinating individual. And again, I shared an article on him. We're going to talk about him a good bit today, and then we'll pick back up on the technical side. We want to talk about his management theory today, but then we're going to talk about his technical contributions next week as well. So, was accepted into Harvard Law School, chose not to go, chose to be a machining apprentice instead, saw that as more rewarding and fruitful for himself. So he set off to do that, work with his hands. On the side, he became the U.S. Nationals tennis doubles champion. So that's now what's known as the U.S. Open. And he just finished fourth in golf in the Summer Olympics. And so on the side, while he was doing this other things, seemed to be a decent athlete as well. And ultimately earned a mechanical engineering degree by trade. He did a little bit of everything in his professional career. So he started as the machining apprentice at a place called Midville Steel in Pennsylvania, and worked his way up from apprentice to full machinist to something called a gang boss, which I absolutely love and I'm put on my business title. I don't even know what that is, but I need it. I need to be one. Foreman, master mechanic, all the way up to ultimately chief engineer. And he did all that by his late 20s, age 27 or so, I think. So one of those whippersnappers that progressed pretty quickly through the organization with kind of a blue-collar mentality. Ultimately, one of his greatest contributions, and according to the Academy of Management, one of the most influential contributions of the 20th century was his publication, The Principles of Scientific Management, which was published in 1911. He was ASME president himself 20 years after he heard Henry Town make his presentation. And then the other thing we have to credit Frederick Taylor with was becoming one of the first of those wonderful, non-sleazy people called management consultants. So we'll look at his management consultant world a little bit next week. But here's what drove him at the heart was efficiency. And there was a call by then President Theodore Roosevelt that talked about efficiency and thus productivity. The conservation of our natural resources is only preliminary to the larger question of national efficiency with those resources. So conserving them is great. We also have to be efficient in how we use them, given that we need to. And so Taylor, based on his observations through his time at Midville Steel, prior to his publication of The Principles of Scientific Management, made observations that the most important fact facing industries of the civilized world is that 19 out of 20 workers, in his observation, believe it is better to go slow than go fast. So it's very important to understand the based on 115 years ago's language, and that is in some of his publications, the way things are phrased. His true intent was not to say the workers are purposely working slow. He was saying that the structure of the organization encourages them and drives them to do so. Which in 2 weeks we will understand a little bit more when we look at things through the lens of workplace motivation. But his goal in the publication of the Principles of Scientific Management was to highlight opportunities for efficiency gains, and thus increase productivity in the workforce, but putting the onus on this function called management to do it. In other words, he's not blaming the workers. He's blaming a lack of management for what he has observed that has taken place in the workforce. And to alleviate that, he introduced 4 principles of scientific management that are necessary to be productive with an organization. So we had Fayol and we had Weber, who were introducing the administrative side of management, how to structure an organization, how to have rules and policies. And then Frederick Taylor, with scientific management, said within the structure of that organization, here's how to actually run things. So I wanted to touch on his 4 principles of scientific management to kind of finish up today. So principle 1 of scientific management was to clearly document the best way to do a task. He had a major complaint with multiple people would show up to do jobs and they would all do it in different ways, operating on things that they had in their head, rules of thumb, practices that they learned from someone, and then they trained someone different, and there was no standardization. So we said there's a great need to observe different ways of doing things, come up with the best way of doing things, and document it, because we can't get better if we don't have a definition of the current best way to do things. We can't possibly have expectations of people if we have no documentation of how things are even supposed to be done. So that was his first principle. Then we get really interesting here. Principle 2 is, now that we have the best way to do a job, pick the best person to do it. Scientifically select the work was his terminology. So a lot of the jobs he had observed out on the steel yard were physical labor jobs. So he was literally talking about get the strongest people to do this, and people with physical attributes. But it's no different than the way we look at jobs now. Maybe not physical attributes, but definitely, depending on the type of work, maybe still physical, but then different skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities that are proven to be more successful than others at different types of jobs, and people that either more naturally have them, are trained to have them, or we have training in place to develop those in people. So at times this was controversial. Then I'll also circle back around, and we just had the Super Bowl on Sunday. I grew up playing and watching sports, loving sports. It's really the only time I have the TV on, even to this day. And I can say, step 1, it could be very clearly documented the best way to play middle linebacker for the Chicago Bears. And I could be trained on how to do that as well as anyone. But if you scientifically select me to do that job, you probably didn't do a very good job, general manager of the Chicago. And so that's part of what he's saying. And scientifically select the best people to do the job and pay them so that you keep them. So document the best way, step 1. Step 2, have the best person to do the best method. Have the best way to do it, have the best person to do it, Step 3, bring those together and train the best person on the best way to do it. And I like these sayings. Well-designed work cannot overcome poor worker selection. We have the best facilities, the best training. We've documented the best way to play middle linebacker, and yet we chose Nick to do it. Poor worker selection doesn't matter how well we have defined. And on the flip side, we could have the best worker in the world, but if we don't have the work defined, we're still going to limit ourselves greatly in terms of productivity as well. Because the best worker can't overcome ill-defined work. The best work cannot overcome poorly selected workers. And it is the manager's job to bring the two together and train the best worker, choose the best worker, and train them on the best way to do things. Step 1, identify the best way. Step 2, scientifically select the worker. Step 3, bring them together to where the best person's following the best method. And step 4, he's putting his own spin on that same thing, keeps popping up. So this is the 4th person now. So we had Adam Smith talk about division of labor. We had Henri Fayol mentioned it as one of his 14 principles of management. We had Max Weber mention this as one of the 6 principles of bureaucracy. Now, the 4th principle of scientific management, Frederick Taylor said we need to have division of work. And he was very specific in what he meant by this. When he talked about division of work, it was workers should work, managers should manage. And on the surface, today, that might seem a little harsh. We're just hiring you to work, not to think. But he actually was looking at it in the other direction, because what he said at this time, during this time, early 1900s, his observation was, we're bringing these people, we're putting them to work, we're not telling them how to even do the work. Management, it's your job to make sure they're in a situation to be successful, and the way we've done it before, you've left it up to them. You've left it up to people doing the job to figure out how to do the job. You haven't given them training, you haven't given them instruction, you've not put them in a situation that's successful. If you haven't done anything toward accomplishing that management, what the heck is your job? You have responsibilities too. So it wasn't workers don't think, it's managers do your job, define what that is, and formalize that. In other words, there should be rules of thumb in place for that job too. You should have people chosen to do that job. They should be trained to be managers, and they should do it. So those are the 4 principles from the management side of scientific management that are attributed to Frederick Winslow Taylor. And so that's a good bridge. We've got a couple of good bridges in this second industrial revolution. Frederick Taylor is a good bridge from the principles of management to the processes and technologies that we'll talk about next week. And then we'll also introduce other people that contributed to processes and technologies. One of which is a couple, married couple, the Gilberts, Frank and Lillian Gilbert. And Lillian Gilbert, finally, we have a mother of something, not a father of something, was credited as one of the first people to bring the concepts of psychology into management, into the workplace, which I really, really dig. And so we'll meet her next week, and she's a good bridge between the processes and technologies and then the people aspects of things that we'll talk about in the 3rd session in this module, where we get into workplace motivation for the first time. So some fun stuff ahead of us here in the second industrial revolution. So we kicked it off tonight by introducing some management principles from Fayol, from Weber, from Freddie Taylor, the gang boss. So that's how we kind of got the stage set. Don't forget, if you haven't, phase 2 of the case study is due tonight. Then phase 3 kicks off. We have 3 weeks. If you're watching this on tape delay, go back and listen to the first 15 minutes or so of class where I talk about the expectations on phase 3. All right, thank you.